Good evening and welcome to the 33rd meeting of 2022 Session 6 of the Equalities, Human Rights and Civil Justice Committee. We have no apologies for the meeting this evening. We are joined today by Emma Roddick, MSP, and we're also expecting to be joined soon by MSPs Ash Regan and Tess White, and you're all very welcome. The only item on our agenda today is to hear from the United Nations experts regarding the Gender Recognition Reform Scotland Bill. We'll first hear from Victor Madrigal-Borloz, United Nations independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, and then from Reem Al-Salam, United Nations Special Rapporteur on violence against women and girls. I refer members to paper 1. And I'd like to welcome Victor Madrigal-Borloz to the meeting and invite Victor to make a short opening statement. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Convener. I'm grateful for this invitation, very grateful to the committee. Pursuant to United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions 3022, 4118 and 5010, the United Nations member states have mandated me to address and investigate root causes of violence and discrimination against persons based on their sexual orientation and their gender identity, also to assess the implementation of relevant international human rights instruments, and to provide advice to states. At the invitation of this committee, I gave my advice in June of this year in relation to the Gender Recognition Reform Bill. On 12 December 2022, I restated that advice. By means of introduction, what I would like to do is to present the reasons for that restatement, my understanding of its placement in the procedure and its scope. So as to the reasons that motivated my restatement, Mr. Convener, as I monitored the public and parliamentary debate in relation to the bill, I have become increasingly concerned about the misrepresentation of the United Nations' long-standing position in relation to legal recognition of gender identity based on self-identification. I'm also concerned about narratives that appear to be utilizing the discussion around the bill as a proxy for reigniting exclusionary discussions on the very existence and rights of trans people. As I noted in my report on narratives of exclusion presented to the United Nations General Assembly, in October of 2021, these narratives often use stigma against trans men and trans women, and generally through a trio of rhetorical levers: the rights of non-trans women and girls, the rights of children, and the issue of sports. I have also grown concerned about the toxicity of this debate and its impact on the safety and security of all, but very particularly trans persons, as these are the very myths that drive much of the violence and harassment that is inflicted upon them. In the most recent survey of the European Fundamental Rights Agency, 50% of trans persons in the UK reported harassment based on their gender identity in the past 12 months, rising to 66% for trans women, which is significantly higher than all LGBT populations combined. 36% of trans women in the UK reported physical or sexual attacks in the past 5 years. This is more than triple the rate for women as a population. As to the procedure followed for my advice in this matter, I understand that my presentation last June was rendered in the correct procedural stage. My restatement and further granularity are descriptive of sources that were available at that moment, and all of which I actually referred to at that moment. There is one sole exception, which is, of course, the report by the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, which was available to the government, I believe, a month before its publication a couple of weeks ago. I have very highly valued the constant interaction of the United Kingdom to the 3 reports that constitute the core of my advice. For example, the statement carried out in 25 June 2021 by the United Kingdom in a comment of one of my reports on gender identity made reference to increasingly toxic and polarizing global debate, particularly on social media, about the concept and process of changing gender. And it actually quite unequivocally stated that one should not discriminate or be discriminated against because of gender identity, when that gender identity is different from that assigned at birth. Finally, Mr. Convener, as to the scope of my advice, my objective has always been to communicate to the Scottish Parliament the acknowledgement of gender and therein gender identity and gender expression within international human rights law, and to actually present what I consider, on the basis of evidence, to be a long-standing position of the United Nations human rights machinery in relation to gender identity and its connection to the standard of self-identification. I have also described the evidence that has led me to the conclusion that there is United Nations consensus on legal recognition of gender identity as inextricably linked with compliance of the fundamental principle of equal protection and recognition before the law, which is a cornerstone of so many of the human rights instruments in the global stage and also in regional law. And finally, I have presented my legal analysis as to why the conflation of legal recognition of gender identity with safeguards of safe spaces, that conflation is not supported by the evidence of or by human rights-based analysis, under which non-discrimination is a fundamental element and a cornerstone. I am, in this context and in the context delineated by that motivation, that procedural understanding, and that scope, I am, of course, very honored to be having this conversation with you today, and I will be very pleased to share whatever elements of evidence I have available to me in that connection. Thank you very much, Mr. Convener.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to questions, starting with Maggie Chapman, please.
Thank you very much, Joe, and good evening, Victor. Thank you for joining us this evening. I want to ask a couple of questions. You mentioned in your opening remarks there the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights, Dunja Mijatovic, the report that she released. And in that, she talks quite clearly about the stigmatizing discourse that both government officials and certain parliamentarians have contributed to, that actually critiques or actually contributes to the culture wars that we are seeing around trans rights, and also that distortion of human rights that have pitted trans rights against women's rights. That distortion of human rights as a zero-sum game. I'm wondering, could you comment on that and give us a little bit more of an explanation as to why you've come to the view you have? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that there are several angles for that analysis, and of course they all find a point of departure in the reality that there doesn't appear to be any socially or politically redeemable reason to actually discriminate against trans people or gender diverse people in general under a human rights-based analysis. And of course, this entails the reality that we are operating under certain structures that historically have existed, that are binary in nature, and that create realities upon which we actually define the language of rights, but also the language of injustice. And I think that this is a rich angle for analysis of both what the Commissioner and myself and many other parts of the human rights machinery have arrived to, and it's that given that there are no socially or politically redeemable reasons to carry out this discrimination against the whole population, and it doesn't resist the analysis of non-discrimination, then the question becomes, what are the reasons why populations and communities are seeing themselves stigmatized, and how prejudice actually works against them? And I think at the basis of the conclusions by the Commissioner is this understanding that there is a weaponization, an instrumentalization of the very existence of in this case, trans and gender diverse persons, to some purposes that in some cases could be described as galvanizing political bases or using these discourses as proxies for other dialogues. And this is where I see a very strong connection with my findings in the reports on narratives of exclusion, in which I actually created an inventory, not only of that triad of elements, which, in succession is always the rights of non-trans women and girls, the rights of children, and the issue of sport, as actually being quite powerful and quite appealing because, of course, they evoke real problematics, but they are actually just making what, in my view, is an artificial connection with those problems and the existence of trans persons. And I found very revealing the findings of the commissioner when she speaks about this idea of and I'm quoting now from her report, deliberate attempts by some politicians to turn the situations of trans people into culture wars or wedge issues for electoral purposes, and how the commissioner, how she is concerned that this has led to a loss of trust by significant parts of the LGBTI community in the government as protectors of their rights. So to me, it all connects with this instrumentalization, if you will, this weaponization of the very existence of trans persons. And again, what is very important to me to underline is I have found it extremely troublesome that in the context of the discussion of the Gender Recognition Reform Bill, which is exclusively meant to simplify a procedure that already exists and introduces no new rights in relation to the legal recognition of gender identity, and yet the popular and political discussion appears to be very much geared at questioning the very existence of trans persons and describing them under such horrifyingly stigmatizing language as men dressed as women, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Victor. That's really helpful. I could come back on a couple of things, but I know the convener is keen to allow everybody to speak, so I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much, Maggie. I'm keen that we get around everyone. We might have time to come back to some. If I can now go to Rachel Hamilton, please.
Thank you, and thank you, Victor, for coming to the committee this evening to give evidence. I wanted to speak to you about the intervention from your counterpart, UN Special Rapporteur for Violence Against Women and Girls, Rina Salem, who said that her safeguarding fears were based on empirical evidence that the majority of sex offenders are male and that persistent sex offenders will go to great lengths to gain access to those they wish to abuse. And she's right, isn't she? We're all aware of countless examples of the lengths that repeat sex offenders do go to access potential victims. Can you firstly tell me why you think that the gender recognition reform, as it is, will not be similarly abused by violent sex offenders if vital safeguards are removed? And if you say that this is a possibility, do you agree that a safeguard to prevent convicted sex offenders applying for a GRC is a reasonable and necessary measure?
Well, thank you very much for that question. I hope you would allow me to shed light on a couple of things, but I do want to make sure that I delimit my answer in one aspect. You've made reference to the submission by my colleague, Special Rapporteur Al-Salem. Nothing, in my opinion, actually is meant to be seen as a commentary or as a discussion on her paper. We are both equally mandated by the Human Rights Council to carry out our work. We have the ambits of our competence well delineated by the resolutions that fundament our mandates. And it's very important for me that it's clearly understood that the only person able to comment on her position from the standpoint of special procedures of the UN is Special Rapporteur Al-Salem. This is, of course, not only a question of collegiality, but it's also a question of recognition of the way in which our mandates are created. So if you will allow me, I'm going to actually try and slightly place how I understand your question to be in a more general context of my opinion. And that is, I am convinced that women are, of course, right to fear violence at the hands of predators, and predatory men in particular. That is absolutely a certainty on my part. They are massively affected by it. And although I actually know Special Rapporteur Al-Salems to be the person in charge of actually analyzing the whole scope of violence against women, I am concerned at this angle from the point of view of lesbian women, bisexual women, and of course trans women in general. And I think one of the ideas that I find actually quite problematic in relation to these connections is how the narrative that I was describing, that is advocated by certain exclusionary narratives, is that there is this connection made with the idea that trans women are actually men in dresses, and therefore be predatory men in dresses. And there is something that is quite off about that, and that I think creates significant possibilities for stigma and discrimination. Trans women are not men in dresses. They're certainly not predatory men in dresses. They're not men at all. And although, of course, I don't think that trans communities and populations need to provide evidence of lack of abuse in the systems that have legal gender recognition based on self-identification, I think that it is telling that in none of those countries there are administrative or judicial findings of predatory men abusing the system to obtain access to places where they, as men, as they are, would not be entitled to gain access to. So to me, I think that there's a great importance to acknowledging that the legal recognition standards that exist, under those legal recognition standards, of course, including in Scotland, I don't think that this legislation is actually making a change in this aspect. They already exist. A trans woman is a woman with all of the rights that a woman has. Now, in my opinion, which of course is the one that I am very much hoping to shed clarity on, I actually explained that in my view, there is no evidence and no legal analysis that concludes that maintaining complexity in the process of recognition of gender identity would be an effective safeguard for women in all of their diversity. And that includes lesbian women, and it includes trans women, and it includes bisexual women, and of course, all other women in all of their diversity. There is no evidence linking to the point that complexity in the procedure of legal recognition is an effective safeguard for women in all of their diversity, or to the goal that we all share, or let's say a very significant proportion of us share, in ensuring freedom of all women from violence and discrimination.
Okay, can I pick you up on the point that you made? Because, I mean, we want to ensure that there is a balance, that women's rights and safety and privacy are protected, which wasn't addressed in your submission to the committee. But I just wanted to ask you about the countries that currently have legal recognition on gender-based self-identification. Are there concrete examples that show that have reduced the number of acts of violence against trans people? So I'm recognising that you're discussing here I'm
sorry.
Did you understand the question? Sorry about that.
let me try and tell you what I understood as your question, and hopefully I have not misunderstood. I think that there is significant evidence coming through in surveys, including the number of policy bodies that have been put in place in countries that not only have legal recognition based on self-ID, but that have legal recognition of gender identity as a policy and have adopted through administrative means or through legal means. That's one thing. And of course, legal recognition of gender identity is recognized in all of those countries and by evidence as one of the essential steps to ensure that violence and discrimination against trans persons, that includes trans men, trans women, it also includes, in many contexts, non-binary and gender diverse persons, legal recognition of their existence and creating a link under that existence with all of the range of state services of which they have been traditionally excluded. And of course, as you may already have seen in some of the evidence that have been presented, that includes access to health centers, it includes access to employment, it includes access to better education, and so on and so forth. So it is a significant step in terms of the wider agenda of social inclusion. And once you actually have better social inclusion, you typically see, of course, as a result, an improvement in the conditions surrounding overall discrimination and violence. But I would like to just also underline the fact that trans women, trans men, gender diverse persons are fighting decades of stigmatizing discourse, prejudice. They, in general, as populations, have significantly lower health outcomes in very many aspects. So in my view, this is a work that is going to take more than a 5 years or 10 years cycle of public policy to ensure that they are not the ones being left behind.
Okay, well, you didn't exactly answer my question about concrete evidence, examples of acts of violence against trans people being reduced, but you talked about other examples of your view. I wondered, Convener, I've got one last question, if I may. I'm slightly confused about the Living Free and Equal report that you talk about, because I believe that from the research that I've done, it doesn't provide a legal basis for the recommendations that you're making. And I wondered on 2 points, is there an obligation for Scotland to enact reform in allowing anyone to change their sex by self-ID? So is there a legal obligation? And secondly, the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission says that the current GRA is in line with international human rights obligations. I just wondered if you agreed on that.
Well, I think that this relates to a question about the way in which my opinion described these different elements. Legal recognition of gender identity is seen widely as I mentioned in my introduction, inextricably linked to equal recognition and protection under the law. And in that sense, it is a human rights obligation as seen uniformly by all United Nations human rights bodies that have expedited themselves in the matter. And when you talk about the report of Free and Equal, that's only one of a series of sources that actually I include in my legal opinion in relation to this. I think there is a significant body of evidence that was compiled by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights when preparing, for example, the legal opinion that the High Commissioner presented to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on advisory opinion OC24. What was contained therein, and which is cited in my opinion, is the legal construction upon which the High Commissioner for Human Rights has based themselves in actually supporting the idea that legal recognition of gender identity is an imperative. I would cite also that the resolutions that create my very own mandate, of which, of course, we know that the United Kingdom is very supportive, create also an understanding that gender identity is a significant driver for violence and discrimination that needs to be assessed, and that the creation of my mandate actually signals that precisely that acknowledgement. I think that then when we talk about self-identification, the understanding is that it's recognized as best practice standard, the standard to follow. And I hope that you will allow me to just say two more sentences in relation to this. One of them is because there has been significant evidence built on the fact that any requirements that actually placed the decision on recognition of gender identity outside of the individual concerned were very, very much seen as violations of human rights. Pathologization is one example. And of course, assessment by judicial or administrative bodies is another example that tended to reproduce stigma and bias.
Okay, thank you. And can I have Karen Adam, please?
Thank you, convener, and good evening, Victor. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to ask you a question in regards to the evidence that you have gathered in regards to this subject, and what were some of the key findings that really stood out to you? I know it's quite a general question, but it could be quite broad. But you know, pinning down a couple of those main issues would be really helpful.
Absolutely. So very quickly to mention to you that in the furtherance of my mandate, I actually carried out 3 main inquiries on the issue of legal recognition of gender identity. And then all of the rest of my work has also surrounded sexual orientation and gender identity. So you could ask me perhaps, or you're asking me, what are my main findings of the last 5 years of my work in the United Nations and my last 15 years as working with these issues? And I think that the main ones I will describe are in the axis of inclusion and exclusion. In the axis of inclusion, I will say that the main findings are 4. First one is gender identity is recognized it's a very robust body of evidence under international human rights law as a trait that must be protected from discrimination and violence. And of course, the second one is that legal recognition allows that creation of a relationship of the individual with the state and eliminate the elements that create social exclusion. And in that sense, trans, non-binary, gender diverse persons around the world significantly benefit from that legal recognition. And I think that this is what your previous colleague's question was inviting me to explain. I can give a very specific example in relation to that. When I started working 15 years ago at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, we did a mapping of violence against trans women, and in particular, killings of trans women. And what we came out back with in terms of official statistics was that there was 0 killings of trans women. And the reason was very simple, because there was no legal recognition of trans women. They were all registered as men that had been killed. And it took a deep dive into the data to actually begin to see the magnitude of violence against them, which now, as we know, in Latin America, 1 trans woman gets killed every day. And elements that, of course, can be extrapolated under different elements. The third finding is that there are significant numbers and elements of evidence supporting the standards that guide legal recognition. And this is where the work of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which I think he restated to one of the media outlets in the UK in the last couple of days, is that there's a number of standards for legal recognition, and that includes self-identification, a simple administrative procedure, and so on and so forth, which I have included in my opinions. And finally, there's another angle of my findings, which is about narratives that I have studied and in which I received significant submissions in my reports on gender. and that is the ones concerning what I call exclusionary narratives that basically either go in the range of denying that trans women exist or trans men or gender non-binary persons to the realm of actually accepting that they exist, but under a somewhat limited legal capacity as human beings that would recognize them as women or men, except for certain cases. And there is where I have actually analyzed the triad of elements that I have mentioned before that come recurrently in the narratives, and where I have analyzed also the risk of perpetuating violence and discrimination and stigma in relation to these issues. One last sentence. I said that all of my other inquiries have angles relating, and of course they have angles relating to lesbian women, bisexual persons, gay men, and so on and so forth. That includes my work on data, where I'm actually quite keen on underlining that I am very worried about the lack of existence of data affecting lesbian women, bisexual women, for example, in the health field, where we tend to have more information on gay men and trans women because they are designated as key population under HIV/AIDS programming. And that means that actually more resources have been available to map their health situation. So the asymmetries within LGBT communities themselves, which impact disproportionately lesbian women and trans men and bisexual persons of both sexes, are also very concerning to me. And there you have an example where my work on data has actually also drawn from these perspectives.
That's really helpful, Victor. Thank you. I'd like to, if I could, just follow up with that, convener, and just ask, in regards to the data, how helpful, it's a hard scale to kind of, pin down, but, how helpful would that be if trans people could gain access to a GRC easier than they are now? Would that help our data overall?
Well, my assumption has always been that complexity in the procedure is a deterrent in itself, right? Complexity in the procedure, the othering of persons, the placement of decisions on a person's gender identity in external bodies other than the individual concerned, all of these issues actually function as a deterrent and therefore tend to blur the picture. The most extreme example of this is, of course, ambits of criminalization, which is not the case in the UK, but countries in which criminalization exists of either sexual orientation and gender identity have, in my view, zero possibilities of claiming integrity, full integrity of their data, because you would never be able to ask people if they're a lesbian or if they're gay under ambits of criminalization. The same thing, I think, is applicable in ambits and environments of deep stigmatization and prejudice, where actually self-identifying and even accessing to procedures might be a deterrent in itself. So, of course, simplicity and adherence to international standards actually will significantly create a more accurate picture of what reality looks like.
Thank you. Thank you, Camilla.
Thank you. And if we can now go to Pam Duncan-Glancy, please.
Thank you, convener, and thank you very much for everything that you've shared with us so far in your evidence, and for giving us your time this evening. Victor, it's much appreciated. I know what you've just said about data and around health, and I'll re-watch or look over the official record after, because I thought that was really helpful, and I know that a colleague of mine has an amendment in on that area, and it's somewhere that we're something that we're really keen to look at. I'll move now to my questions. You will have heard, as I'm sure you will have heard, that some people have been quite worried about this legislation, and I note that your concerns about some of the conflations that have been made and the worries that have been raised. But I just want to ask you specifically about the impact in some countries of self-declaration systems, and whether or not you've seen any evidence anywhere of women who have self-excluded from women's-only spaces as a result of this.
Thank you very much for that question, because it's actually quite, of course, I think that it's a significant concern for even the overlap between different mandates. Because, of course, as I've said to you, I actually have the mandate of studying discrimination and violence against lesbian women, bisexual women. So it goes beyond the remit of only trans women, and I'm concerned about services and spaces in that connection. Now, on this, I rely on those that gather information best, which is governments, and in the absence of governments, civil society in relation to the field. I am guided, for example, by the statement that I understand and that I've read, made by 7 organizations operating services in Scotland that have been operating trans-inclusive services for what I understand is 15 years, and have reported no particular instances of abuse or patterns of self-exclusion. Same thing, I would say, from other countries in which self-identification is the standard, as well as countries that have legal recognition, even though they haven't achieved the standard of self-identification. These are trends that I actually need to see until the evidence say otherwise as hypothetical. Now, I would like to tell you that, of course, my work didn't start when I was appointed United Nations Independent Expert. I have been a member of the Subcommittee for Prevention of Torture, where I visited crisis centers and hospitals and centers in many countries of the world. And because of my particular remit as rapporteur on LGBT issues, I actually visited particular centers that had either inclusionary or exclusionary policies. I never saw that type of trend being documented in any country that I visited, which of course included countries that have legal gender recognition. Before that, I was the technical advisor in charge of creating the unit on LGBTI issues at the Inter-American Commission. We did significant mapping. This is not an issue that ever came as a trend. To me, it's actually puzzling on the basis of which evidence that argument is being made. And particularly because I assume that in case that a need had arisen where claims of self-exclusion, I would imagine that there would have been diagnosing studies, and I'm not aware of such trends or relating evaluations on that end.
Thank you. I appreciate that fulsome answer. On a similar vein, just where you finished there on evaluations and reviews, you'll know that a number of people who are critical of the legislation have said that an absence of evidence is not an evidence of absence. So Scottish Labour have proposed amendments asking for regular reviews of the impacts of the legislation to gather the information that we might need. Have you seen any examples of similar monitoring in international legislation, and what has it found?
Well, yes, I think two issues in relation to that. The first one is that in my experience of dialoguing for as long as I have been working, public policy makers, evaluations and studies are usually made on the basis of a need. You begin by actually having certain working theories that arise from administrative or judicial findings, and then you actually may work your way into patterns or models, which then lead to working theories that require studies or evaluations in this respect. And I think I used the expression before of saying that otherwise what one is, creating solutions in search of problems. And I don't think this is the way in which evaluation of public policy goes. And again, because of the absence of particular judicial or administrative findings that actually would go and reveal these trends, I'm not really sure that that's a strong fundament to actually go on a whole line of inquiry that appears to have already predetermined what the finding would be. So to me, that's not the way I understand public policy and evaluation of public policy works, unless, of course, is used with a particular objective, which in this case might be to, again, look for a problem to match a solution that has already been found.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Can I go to Pam Gossel?
Thank you, Convener, and good evening, Victor. Due to time constraints, the committee hasn't been able to hear from many groups who wanted to give evidence to the committee, including survivors of domestic violence and abuse. Why do you think it was important that we hear from you for the second time, and what new evidence do you bring with you today to the committee?
Oh, well, thank you very much for that question. It allows me perhaps to bring more clarity to the framework that I created in my introduction. I think that it was important that I accept the invitation because I am mandated by the United Nations member states to provide advisory services where governmental and state agencies so require. And therefore, I don't think that it would be in a very happy position if I were to reject such a kind and generous invitation to make some clarifications in relation to the opinion that I rendered in June. You may be perhaps asking as to why I was invited, but clearly the motivation for the invitation is something that I don't have control of myself. Having said that, I do have the ability of actually considering whether something is absolutely redundant. And I don't think that's the case because from the way the public debate has actually proceeded since June, there were, as I said, three elements that were deeply concerning to me. One is what I consider to be the misrepresentation of this long-standing position of the UN, which was reinforced, amongst others, by the statement of the High Commissioner for Human Rights to a media outlet in the last few days. And the other ones were, of course, the continued use of this conversation, in my opinion, in that context, as a proxy for a discussion that appears not to be connected to it, which is an argument about the very legal recognition of gender identity, which in my understanding is not what this bill is about. So I think that there is in my mind, there is a very clear added value in reinstating what the international human rights law acknowledgement of gender identity, of legal recognition, and that absence of connection with the whole issue that we are debating in relation to the specifics of simplifying the procedure.
Thank you, Victor. Just adding on to that question. The Muslim Council of Scotland has written in a letter to the Cabinet Secretary in which they state, for Muslims, where protected single-sex spaces are a religious requirement for the ablution and the prayer, and for access to a range of services and leisure opportunities, this proposed legislation risks undermining a range of their human rights by opening access to legal masqueraders. But at the same time also, the Scottish Association of Mosques wrote to the Cabinet Secretary stating, this bill would potentially give access to female-only spaces and services, including critical safe spaces for girls under 16 to men who have self-declared their gender, including at places where women and girls are most vulnerable. This creates a clear safeguarding issue. These organisations represent thousands of Muslims in Scotland. In your opinion, are they wrong to hold these concerns? And could you please tell the committee what analysis you have undertaken of the impact of this bill on women of faith and their access and or self-exclusion from single-sex services and spaces?
Thank you very much for that question. It dwells into something that I'm currently very interested in, which is this alleged tension between freedom of religion and belief and freedom from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So thank you very much for that. So I would place it in the general context of my joint work with the United Nations successive United Nations Special Rapporteurs on Freedom of Religion and Belief, the first manifestation of which was the issuance of a statement backed up by, I believe it was 115 independent experts at United Nations and regional level, in which there was a clear point of departure on the fact that in the substance of the functioning of these rights, not only there is no contradiction, but there is actually interdependence and mutual reinforcement. And the reason for that is because freedom of religion and belief and freedom from violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity are both based on the number of rights articulated in the global and regional systems that actually refer to equal recognition before the law, freedom of expression, and in general, dignity and the constructions that are attached thereto. And I think that this already gives you a clue as to what my thinking is in relation to these issues, and which I will elaborate further on when I present my report to the Human Rights Council in June of 2023 on this very issue, which is the connectivity of these two conceptual constructions. And I don't think, by the way, that concerns are ever wrong. I think that what is very healthy is to understand what are the bases of concerns and how they can be actually addressed through respectful democratic debate. So you make reference of particular communities that fear that men masquerading as women will penetrate certain spaces. And on that, I would actually say that there is one element in the legal construction that answers to this, and it's legal recognition of gender identity implies that trans women are women. And therefore, you cannot make the construction under human rights-based approaches that trans women are men penetrating any space whatsoever. Now, in the cases where they may be legitimate concerns, and this is something that the Commissioner on Human Rights by the Council of Europe brilliantly described in her report, in the cases where they may be significant, let's say, views and concerns that arise in a process of integration, then they need to be solved on a case-by-case basis. And that, in particular, requires an analysis that is called, of course, on the basis of non-discrimination analysis, which has a number of elements which are very uniform throughout international human rights law, which is proportionality, necessity, and so on and so forth. My point here is that what is not supported by the evidence in relation to international human rights-based approaches is that you would restrict the rights of a whole community of population based on a particular stigmatizing or discriminatory view. So that includes, of course, instances where particular women may have long-held trauma in relation to particular populations, and how to handle that needs to be done on the basis of non-discrimination analysis. I think my message in here is there are tools in the international human rights-based system to actually ensure that legitimately held concerns, as the Commissioner of Human Rights of the Council of Europe has said, can be channeled in a way that is non-discriminatory, non-stigmatizing in nature.
Okay, and a brief supplementary from Rachel Hamilton.
Thank you, Joe. Victor, just on this point, your mandate stresses the importance of respecting regional, cultural and religious values in terms of human rights. How will the gender reform in terms of a self-ID system impact everyone's human rights across the United Kingdom?
I think it will bring the United Kingdom closer to conformity with what is considered the standard at the moment for legal recognition of gender identity. I am, however, not sure that I would place my evaluation in that connection in particular religious or social mores. this is not really the angle that I'm actually basing my analysis on. My analysis is one of international human rights law systems in which the United Kingdom is, like every other state, a key stakeholder in the formation of what is a consensus that has been long held. So it would be very puzzling to me how this decided position in relation to legal recognition of gender identity could actually, which has been held, and again, I gave at my introduction a reference to the constructive and clear interaction that the United Kingdom has had in relation to my reports. It's very hard for me to see how this could be, in a way, a contradiction.
Okay, thank you. And Fulton McGregor.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good evening to Victor. My question, Victor, is on something that you've actually already referred to, and it's last week the Council of Europe's Commissioner for Human Rights in her report on her visit to the UK, in which she notes that, and I quote here, trans persons in the UK face increasingly hostile and toxic political and public discourse. What's your views on this, and can you comment on the impact such discourses, such as that, as we've seen during the course of this debate, are having on this and any minority community?
I'm sorry, it was not very clear, the sound. Can I ask you to please repeat the question?
Yeah, no problem. Do you need me to repeat it right from the start?
Just the question.
Just the question, okay. I wonder if you can comment on the impact of such discourse, what impact it can have on the trans community here in Scotland and indeed any minority community.
Thank you very much. Well, this is of course a very interesting question. I've already referred to the fact that in what concerns my remit, which is of course persons affected by discrimination and violence based on sexual orientation and gender identity, I have significant concerns about how this admittedly toxic debate actually will impact the notion of what safe spaces are and how persons will be relating to those safe spaces when they face in that space persons that in the beginning of things should not be stigmatized as men dressed as women, penetrating those spaces for predatory purposes. I am enormously concerned of what this is going to do to actually the perception of safety in those spaces. And again, this is in the light of just the realization that it is absolutely arbitrary, undemocratic to take away the rights of a whole community, in this case trans women or trans men, just because they are these long-held views that they don't really exist or that they're not really women. Now, I need to be, let me be quite measured in the way that I extrapolate this to other communities, because it is not my area of expertise, but I think for politicians that are debating and considering the matter, one of the questions that I think is valid is to what extent this actually affects a wider population of women and girls. To what extent the stigma and discrimination against trans persons and the nature of their presence in these spaces is actually going to create an atmosphere, an artificial atmosphere of moral panic and impact the notion of safety in these spaces. And I think that therein lies significant political responsibility to ensure that the debate is evidence-based and abandons stigma as one of the departure points.
Okay, thank you. And Emma Roddick, I think your final question.
Thank you, Convener. You've talked a lot about the toxicity of the debate in the UK and the effect that this is having on trans people in particular, but also cisgender women, because as you say, they've every reason to be afraid of predatory men. So elected representatives and celebrities linking this legislation to that separate issue is going to cause fear. I wondered if that's something you've seen happen on a similar scale in other countries which have implemented similar procedures, and whether you have advice for politicians on how to address those concerns, maybe best practice that you've seen elsewhere.
Thank you very much for that question. In my report on narratives and practices of exclusion, I actually studied quite a wide evidence base in this respect. And I believe that there's a number of contexts which are cited in that report in which I've seen these stigmatizing attitudes translate into that zero-sum game dialogue that the Commissioner of Human Rights of the Council of Europe was referring to. And of course, this is to the gain of those that are actually feeding this frenzy, but I don't think it's in the gain of communities and populations that are historically submitted to discrimination and violence, and that pretty much includes a chunk across populations and communities around this globe. So I think that it is a rather destructive use of trans lives for instrumentalizing their purposes, but also of narratives invoking the very real issue of violence against women in all of their diversity at the service of the creation of this atmosphere of moral panic that feeds these purposes. And my advice, I think it's by no means something that is a mystery, is evidence. Stigma is by definition fueled by lack of evidence. You're just hoping that your voice is loud enough or strong enough, or that it appears to be supported by a sufficient number of persons, and then you're hoping that that will be the evidence in itself. That's the definition of rhetorical devices. And I think that against that, and I use the word intently, against that kind of approach, evidence-based approaches are actually asking everyone to take a look at the evidence that exists, that is credible, that is not basically planted in there, but it's actually following due process, scientific methods, ethical frameworks of research, so that studies can actually ensure a credibility framework, and then conclude what the evidence tells us. And so far, what the evidence tells me is this connection is artificial.
Okay, thanks very much. I think we have gone a bit over time, so I'm going to end this session here. Thanks hugely, Victor, for making time to come along. We'll now suspend the meeting and we'll resume in about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Convener, and thank you to everyone. I got a great honor to be with you. Goodbye.